the dank smell of the waiting room could not calm the anxiety in my stomach. Looking around and then returning to my feet, I doubted the purpose of my presence here. To my left sat my beloved wife, Rachel, radiating her usual radiance. Her beauty never ceased to cause butterflies in me. To my right sat my daughter, Jasmine, a constant source of salvation. My thoughts went back to the day I first met them. I was a different person in those days. Mr. GR's voice brought me back to the present. "We will be ready to receive you in about 20 minutes, he said. "Another witness is speaking now." I nodded my appreciation. It had been more than a year since I saw my ex-wife, with whom I had been married for 12 years. A lot has changed since then. I'll start by telling you about the day that changed my life forever. It was a typical spring day in Albany, New York. I was returning home from a customer service job at a local utility company. I despised this job, but Jessica, my ex-wife, pushed me to it. "This is a more reliable and financially profitable job," she said. "It's better than building." Her words usually followed. I should have realized earlier that she seemed to care only about money and social status. I don't want to get too deep into Jessica, but at 35, she was still the most beautiful woman in the world for me. She was smart, witty, and adored me from the first minute we met. I always thought she was too much for me. When we first met, I was working on a construction site in the Bronx. I was tall and pretty good-looking, with a permanent tan from being outdoors all the time. From the very beginning of our relationship, we were inseparable. I was her protector, a source of entertainment, and she, ignoring my lack of academic success, loved me even more. After she got her master's degree, we moved back to her hometown of Albany and eventually got married. Her old friends and relatives thought she was too good for me and wondered why she married a man below her. According to her father, I was just a handsome fool. But despite this, we were happy and loved each other very much. Being an only child, both my parents passed away in their late teens. Jessica became the whole world for me. I found a job at a construction site, and Jessica got a promising position in a financial company owned by a friend of her father. During the economic downturn in 2008, I lost my job, and only Jessica's salary helped us through difficult times. It only increased her parents' contempt for me, if that's even possible. This has left its mark on our marriage, which is not surprising when the people you love and communicate with constantly tell you that your husband is a loser. Unfortunately, this also affected my friendships at home in the Bronx. In their opinion, I was now moving in different circles. Fortunately, my best friend, Joey, was always there for me. He was more like a brother to me. His parents supported me during a difficult time when I lost my own parents. But it was Jessica who finally convinced me to take a job at a utility company, despite the fact that I really did not like this job with its closed rooms, working at the computer, and forced conversations on the phone. I reluctantly made an attempt for the sake of Jessica and our future together. Although we both wanted to start a family someday, Jessica attached more importance to a successful career and the perception of herself as a successful person. I, on the contrary, did not attach much importance to appearance, wealth, and social status. Despite all my efforts, I fulfilled all Jessica's wishes, even tried to mold myself into who she wanted me to be. Unfortunately, when you give up your true self, everything goes awry, and gradually, you turn into an unsatisfied person. The bright builder from the Bronx who once appreciated levity and fun has ceased to exist. Instead, I found myself in a state of melancholy, burdened with excess weight, neglecting personal hygiene, and practically not participating in social contacts, if at all. In fact, I was a plump man working in an office, married to a successful financial analyst who communicated with the best people in Albany at extravagant parties and cocktail parties. Alas, I was not one of them, as both they and I knew perfectly well. Arriving at her place, I was surprised to find that Jessica's car was in the garage. With a sense of foreboding, I got out of my car and headed for home. I can't explain why, but an indescribable fear seized me when I entered the kitchen where Jessica was sitting at the table with a serious but determined expression on her face. Documents were spread out in front of her, and as soon as I was about to say a word, she quickly intervened, interrupting me. "Mikey, we need to talk." These notorious words struck me with an irresistible force. Although I noticed a hint of nervousness in her behavior, there were no tears in her eyes. When I sat down in the chair, worried, I asked if everything was okay. She pulled herself together, cleared her throat as if preparing for an important statement. "I'm sorry, Michael, but I want a divorce," she said clearly and calmly. A wave of despair swept over me, making my stomach clench into a ball and my heart ache. I was confused, as if someone put a hand on my chest and forcefully grabbed my heart. The experience of sudden loss, a feeling so painful that words cannot convey its power, has haunted me twice already. It penetrates into every fiber of your being like an inexorable virus. I looked at her, and my voice trembled as I gathered the strength to speak. "But why?" I stuttered. Without a shadow of sympathy, she met my gaze and confessed, "I found love elsewhere." At that moment, my world collapsed, but a strange lack of shock gripped me. Thanks to Jessica, I stopped being the old Mikey Green. Now I was an empty shell of the person I once was, and here she stands, completing my death with the last blow of the blade. "4 months," she replied. Her words pierced through me, and I just looked at her. But now she has declared that she wants to be with him and get married, completely ignoring my emotions. I looked at the stranger in front of me, and she, in turn, looked at the stranger in me. I don't need specifics, but I need to understand why. I finally squeezed out of myself, dreading her answer. Without thinking, she quickly gave an answer. As she spoke, a flood of long pent-up emotions surged. "Mikey, just look at yourself carefully. You're not the man I married. You've let yourself go, gained weight, neglected self-care, and when was the last time you invested in new clothes?" Her words were full of disappointment and annoyance. "You've become just a shadow of the person I fell in love with. Let's face it, you've never matched my intellectual level, have you?" Her tone became mocking. "Over the past 10 years, I've lost count of how many times I've had to defend you in front of your parents, friends, and colleagues. It's exhausting." As she continued to speak, I was already beginning to doubt where the girl I once loved very much was, and instead of her, an insensitive creature was sitting in front of me, trying to justify our initial decision to marry. She went on to describe the qualities of my replacement, a man named Rich, who turned out to be younger, physically fit, attractive, had a thriving business, and a luxurious house conveniently located next to his parents in Ludenville. Every word that escaped from her lips felt like a sharp blade piercing my being. Resigned, I plucked up the courage and asked, "Do I know him?" To which she replied, "He runs a gardening company that serves our neighborhood. Now he works as an individual entrepreneur, but we plan to develop the business together," she said, and I remained silent. Having finished her speech, she was waiting for another question, probably intending to get the better of me even more. When I remained silent, she pushed the documents towards me. The divorce papers were prepared with the assistance of my father and his lawyer. "I believe that they contain a beneficial agreement for you. Considering that I contributed most of the funds for the mortgage, my father offered to divide the house in my favor in the ratio of 70 to 30. This arrangement suits me, since I will live together with Rich Amin," she said, and I looked at her. She continued talking. "Now, I think it's fair to divide our savings equally, 50 to 50, and I don't require alimony, although I'm sure I could fight for some form of support if I wanted to." The arrogance and anger in her tone became obvious to me. How could I not notice all this for so many years? I felt like a fool, and she always seemed to see me that way. "Let's face it, Mikey, I earn a lot more than you, and my new partner is also financially stable, so I won't touch your 401k if you agree to sign the papers without resisting." Her voice trailed off. When I met her gaze, my old self flashed through it, which she couldn't ignore, which made her swallow nervously. Without hesitation, I took a pen and, having signed the documents, refused 12 years of marriage. Getting up from the table, I headed to her bedroom to pack my things and return. She remained sitting, immersed in reading papers, and I silently walked past her. I left her life that day. "Is she crazy?" said my friend Joey, who is like family to me. Although in recent years, I have unfortunately neglected him, as true brothers, we can ignore mistakes and always support each other when we need it. While discussing the situation, I heard someone talking in the background, and Joey tried to calm him down. I asked, wondering what she was talking about. "Yo, Mikey," Joey replied. She told you to get rid of that snob. Joey and Helen never held back their thoughts. I am very sorry that I did not understand the truth earlier, and that's exactly how I behaved before, Mikey. I know a man through Helen who specializes in investigating debtors for local businesses. I can ask him to check this guy out for you to make sure he's trustworthy, although he may ask in his typical rude manner. Personally, I don't care, I said with a note of sadness. This guy steals your wife, and you just let it happen. Damn it, Mikey, he exclaimed, his voice getting even louder. It hurt a lot, and Joey seemed to get it too. I'm sorry, brother. I'm just as furious, and I'd like you to feel the same, he said apologetically. It's okay, Joey. You were right in all that. Do whatever you want, I replied. I told him the scant details I knew about this new guy. He worked as a neighbor's gardener, so it wouldn't be difficult to gather additional information if Helen's boyfriend wanted to get it. You need to switch, Mikey, and get back to your old lifestyle, he instructed before we finally ended the conversation. After finishing the conversation, I leaned back on the worn-out motel bed and stared at the ceiling fan buzzing alarmingly overhead. My head was a complete mess. I was trying to make sense of a series of events that had happened in my life, not only over the past few hours but also over the past 12 long years. I couldn't sleep, so I reached for the bottle of Jack Daniels on the table and took a sip straight from it. This became a routine for the following weeks. Often at work, I pretended to be sick or came with the smell of alcohol, as a result of which I was immediately sent home. The whole office kept its eyes on me, watching my deteriorating condition. When snide remarks were heard behind my back, I could not get rid of the feeling of detachment, as if I was watching my existence from the sidelines. Going to the doctor turned out to be useful to some extent, but giving up work gave me enough time to reflect on the past. Unfortunately, I never managed to get to the office of Jones and Brown to complete the divorce process. Instead, an email was sent to my workplace because no one bothered to inquire about my whereabouts. I've already accepted that. In the envelope, I found a divorce settlement and a check for a total of $175,000. This amount represented my legal share in our common property, including the house, savings, and household property. Surprisingly, the settlement agreement took into account all the details that Jessica had talked about during our conversation at the kitchen table. Unfortunately, I was not present at that fateful meeting, as a result of which the agreement was concluded in my absence. Doubts about the legality and fairness of these agreements still remained, but I no longer had the strength for further disputes. My stamina dried up, especially when I was faced with Jessica's influential entourage. It's been a month since Jessica announced her desire for a divorce, and I've just deposited a check into my bank account. After checking our other accounts, I realized that Jessica had already closed them and deleted her name from our shared account. Feeling lost, I was wandering aimlessly around the bank when suddenly a familiar voice called my name. At first, I didn't pay attention to him, but curiosity got the better of me, and when I turned around, I saw Pete and Shelley, my old neighbors, approaching me. Pete came up to me with a note of nervousness in his voice and expressed his condolences about the divorce. Shelley, who turned out to be our nosy neighbor and a passionate gossip, wasted no time. I can't believe Jessica left you and got married again so quickly, she exclaimed. Her words took me by surprise. I vaguely remembered that Jessica had talked about her desire to marry this guy, but my state of mind at that moment was such that I completely forgot about it. Trying to appear impassive, I said, "Oh, you didn't know?" Shelley continued. "We thought you two were a real couple." Peter even mentioned it, and then to our surprise, we found out that she had married this Richard Walton. This was the first time I knew his full name, but watching Shelley's reaction, one could see that the mere mention of his name made her flinch and recoil. Despite this, I didn't pay attention to her reaction because I realized that now I have a last name that I can point out to Joey's friend and not just call him Rich the gardener from Albany. "This is the gardener who looks after your neighborhood," I remarked, giving the unsolicited information. As soon as I said these words, I noticed that Peter abruptly turned to Shelley, who by this time had turned bright red. "The gardener," he exclaimed, shouting at Shelley and attracting the attention of outsiders. "Why are you blushing?" he asked, and I immediately realized my mistake. "No, Peter, no, please," Shelley pleaded. "He tried to molest me once, but I turned him down." Peter blushed and became increasingly furious as Shelley continued, "He's a disgusting person, and whenever he's around, I make sure to leave for a few hours to avoid him." "I never told you because I knew you would get angry," she said, holding out her hand to him and pleading with him. "We need to talk," he said, turning to me and apologizing. Gripping her hand tightly, he forcefully led her down the sidewalk. Reflecting on the situation, I couldn't help thinking that Jessica and Richard's thriving empire had just lost a valuable client. Despite the gloomy state, after what seemed like an eternity, a faint smile appeared on my face. The news of their wedding was undoubtedly a heavy blow for me, plunging me into the abyss of despair. In desperation, I slouched even more, succumbing to depression, and instinctively reached for the bottle again. At that moment, I decided to drown myself in alcohol, hoping that this would ease the enormous pain and save me from continuing this seemingly aimless existence. The next day, I woke up in my motel bed and immediately collapsed on the floor, spitting and covered in vomit. It was a clear sign that I had reached my lowest point. On all fours, I managed to drag myself into the shower, where I sought solace under an icy cascade of water. When I got out of the shower, I saw my reflection in the mirror and was completely stunned. Disappointment overwhelmed me, and I angrily lashed out with insults at the one who looked at me. In response, realizing that I urgently needed to improve my situation, stunned, I knelt down, and tears flowed down my face, the first outlet of emotions after the death of my mother. At that moment, with my hands over my mouth, I shouted out my wish for happiness. It was quite clear that something needed to be changed. On Monday morning, I walked into my office, ready to start completing the tasks for the day. To my surprise, there was a stack of personal mail lying neatly on the table, most likely redirected since my colleagues did not know my current address. After sorting through the mostly useless correspondence, I drew attention to a leaflet advertising the nearest gym, which said that in just 12 weeks, you can change your physique. With a slight smile, I wondered skeptically if it was really possible to achieve significant results in such a short period of time. Yet, the thought came to mind, why not try? Perhaps this is the very change that I have been looking for so long. Going into the gym in the evening, I had no idea how a young and stunning instructor standing in front of me would perceive a person like me. Despite the fact that I was only 38 years old, I felt as if an 80-year-old man lived in me. But when I approached her, she held out her fragile hand, which I gratefully accepted. "I'm Jasmine," she introduced herself. It would be an understatement to say that she immediately noticed that I was completely upset, but I caught a glimmer of hope in her captivating brown eyes. It wasn't unwillingness or a romantic performance, but the honesty and empathy that radiated from her gaze filled me with new energy. I strictly adhered to the diet, refusing all the temptations that arose in my way. The kilograms began to melt, and every week, I felt my self-confidence growing. Moving to a one-room apartment was the new start that I needed. It was a symbol of my determination to change my life for the better. By focusing on my 12-week plan, I realized that this journey is not just to lose weight, it was about rediscovering myself, rediscovering the person I lost along the way. The gym has become my refuge, my escape from the noise and chaos of the city. I put all my energy into training, forcing myself to work like never before. The progress I was making was undeniable, and this fueled my motivation for further action. Joey and Helen started coming less often, but I understood them, they had their own life, and I was grateful for the minutes we spent together. To lose 50 kilograms at first seemed an impossible task, but over time, as the weeks turned into months, it became more and more achievable. I've learned to celebrate every little victory along the way, whether it's getting into smaller jeans or achieving a new personal best in the gym. It was these little moments that kept me going, reminding me that I was on the right track. And when the figure on the scale continued to decrease, I saw how not only my body but also my mind and spirit were transformed. I am very far away from the person who was drowning in doubts and bad habits. I found a new life, a new self-confidence that radiated from within. The path was still far from being completed, but I knew that I had the strength and determination to bring it to the end. Thanks to Jasmine's constant support, I managed to lose 14 kilograms by the end of the month. An additional advantage of the fact that I spent most of the day in the gym was the opportunity to get to know Jasmine more deeply. After one of the training sessions, she kindly accepted my invitation to drink coffee, which allowed me to learn more about her personal life. It turned out that she grew up in a single-mother family and is currently studying at a community college to fulfill her dream of becoming a fitness trainer and nutritionist. Her experience in this field made a great impression on me, and my admiration for her grew. I told her about my recent divorce and my past experiences living in the Bronx. I admitted that I had reached a low point before I decided to sign up for the gym and eventually met her. I tried not to sound desperate or intrusive, but she showed compassion and emotional maturity beyond her age. Only after a few classes, when I met her near the shower, I was really amazed. Jasmine was talking to a woman who looked strikingly like her sister Courtney if I remember correctly. I know it may seem incredible, but it's really true. Before I could look away and walk away, Jasmine caught my eye and started walking towards me, smiling. She introduced her mother, Rachel, who held out her hand to me. When our eyes met, I was overwhelmed by a wave of embarrassment, and I was speechless, and my stomach clenched into a ball. The silence became increasingly awkward. Sensing my predicament, Jasmine laughingly diffused the tense situation and came to my rescue. "He just keeps quiet when he likes someone," she explained to her mother, as if she had known me for many years. I used to be a different person, not always quiet, shy, and unassuming. Looking back, I realized that years of emotional pressure, as I now understand, have left their mark on me. When Jasmine left to pack her things, Rachel and I started talking. When Jasmine returned, she kindly invited me to have dinner with them on the other side of the road. At first, I hesitated, but her persistence did not allow me to refuse. I couldn't help but imagine that if she had a father, he would be completely devoted to her. During dinner, Rachel radiated warmth and kindness. During the evening, it became clear that the apple had not fallen far from the tree. I found solace in their presence, and there was no need for pretentiousness or superficiality. They were sincere people who did not feel a sense of superiority over others. Rachel, in particular, was able to make light jokes, which immediately endeared me to communication. We briefly touched on her past, and it seems that Jasmine brought her mother up to date on my life. Leaving that evening, I felt a sense of satisfaction that had not left me for many months, if not years. To my surprise, I even had Rachel's phone number, which she kindly agreed to exchange. I decided to deal with the chaos in my head, or rather, she insisted on it. I hesitated at first, but eventually gave in, knowing Rachel's experience as a hairdresser. Her reaction, a delightful laugh, was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard from a woman. In the following months, our bond became stronger and stronger. We became inseparable. The moments we shared were filled with strong and tender passion, always perfect. From that moment on, all my thoughts were occupied only with her, and my heart was beating exclusively for this incredible woman. Realizing the significance of Jessica's presence, I was wary of hasty relationships. I wanted her not to feel like just a replacement for Jessica. We had both experienced betrayal in the past, so trust was of great value to us. When our bond got stronger, I decided to introduce her to my hometown, where Joey and Helen quickly accepted her. During a private conversation in the kitchen, Helen expressed confidence that Rachel is the perfect match for me and urged me not to miss her. I reassured her, stressing that the possibility of this is absolutely excluded. "Truth, I can't believe I weigh exactly 80 kilograms. I exclaimed excitedly. Jasmine confirmed, "Yes, it's true," she giggled, calling me by my new nickname. "You're back to your ideal weight, Dad." I felt a sense of pride and gratitude towards Jasmine and Rachel for their help in achieving this result. Reflecting on my weight loss, I wondered if my new haircut and the decision to shave off my beard played a role in this. Rachel convinced me to try to shave clean so she could see my face, and I couldn't help but laugh at her suggestion. I just hoped she wouldn't be scared off by the person hiding behind the facade. Fortunately, she didn't turn away, and then I found myself on cloud 9. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I did what I set out to do. I looked and felt great, just like when I was working on a construction site in New York. I headed towards Rachel's house, feeling elated. When I walked in the door, I was greeted by a nervous and pale Rachel. The concerned expression on her face made me feel déjà vu. "What's wrong, baby?" I asked nervously, feeling a familiar sense of foreboding. "We need to talk," she said suddenly. It seemed to me that the walls closed around me, the familiar feelings surged again, and nausea came to my senses. "Okay," I said when Rachel took my hand and led me to sit down. "Listen, Rachel, if you're going to break up with me, then do it quickly so that I have time to leave," I said sharply, causing her to recoil in shock. "No, honey," she replied, squeezing my hand tighter and pulling me to her. "I do not know how to say this because I do not want you to be angry with me," she said hesitantly. My sense of horror has not diminished. "I'm pregnant," she announced. I was in shock. We were silent for a few seconds, looking at her beautiful face, pitted with wrinkles, trying to assess my reaction. I got to my feet and took a few steps away. I turned back to her, looking worried and on the verge of tears. I shouted at the top of my lungs, simultaneously jumping in the air with joy and relief. Her face lit up, and joy appeared in her eyes again. "Aren't you angry?" "What is it?" she asked, regaining her beautiful smile. "How can I be angry?" "I'm going to be a dad," I announced, took her in my arms, and kissed her passionately on the lips. We hugged each other for the next 5 minutes. I was the happiest person in the world. Over the next few days, Rachel, Jasmine, and I started looking for a house. Despite the fact that Rachel had very little savings, I had almost $180,000 in the bank, which was more than enough to buy a house from scratch. It took less than a week to find a beautiful 5-bedroom colonial house in Pine Hills. Although the house required repairs, which scared off other buyers, my construction experience allowed me to assess its potential. Our offer was accepted, which meant that we did not need to take out a mortgage loan. On the day of moving into our new house, I got down on one knee and proposed to Rachel. I knew it was fast, but I loved her very much, and she was the only one for me. She agreed, and I would like to say that we have lived happily ever after since, but that would ignore the reason why I'm sitting here in this courthouse. To be clear, I was not accused of anything. A few weeks after moving into our new home, Joey called me. It was, to put it mildly, crushing. I had completely forgotten that Joey had asked Helen's colleague to check on my ex-wife's new husband. And Joey, to be honest, too. If this had been going on for months, I had no idea what it would cost me. And to be honest, I didn't even want to know what he found out. But anyway, Joey was overjoyed and just had to tell me about his findings. I was silent when Joey started talking. "It's all a house of cards, Mikey," he said, laughing. "Helen's man unearthed everything. And after you gave your full name, everything started spinning." It turned out that the IRS and the feds were involved, I shouted, thinking I had missed an important part of the story. "What do you mean the feds are involved?" "Just listen, Mikey, just listen," he said, trying to calm me down. "In the gardening company he owns, Jessica is listed as a director, and she has serious debts. Mikey, I mean serious debts. And this is just for starters. The house he now owns has Jessica's name on the documents, and it costs more than $1 million. But mortgage payments are made through a company called Ritual Enterprises. This company owns both a house and a business. Jessica and Richard are listed as co-owners, and they started trading just 6 months ago, probably right after their wedding," Joey explained. I tried my best to keep up, and I knew Joey was doing his best to convey what Helen had obviously told him. Helen contacted the tax service, which, by the way, will take care of all expenses. I was pleased to know that I would not be charged a huge bill. Anyway, the IRS investigated Richard Walton and found out that they were looking for him. They had a picture of him or something like that. "So he's a fraud," I said, stating the obvious. "Yeah, sure, Mikey, but wait until you hear what happened next," he said, teasing me. Well, this investigation has attracted the attention of a major corporation in Charlotte, North Carolina. His name is Davis Nolan, and he has a daughter named Julia Reed. She currently lives separately from her husband, Kyle Reed. They have 2 children together, and okay, by this point, I was seriously puzzled. "Come on, Joey," I said in exasperation, "don't get distracted, man." It turns out that Kyle Reed is Richard Walton, I shouted into the phone, and Joey probably had a ringing in his ears. Not that he cared, he was too busy to laugh at his own joke. "Yes, and they are still legally married." I think they call him a bigamist or something, but that's not the best, he said, leaving me in limbo. It was starting to look like a Hollywood movie or something. The FBI got involved in the case, and it turned out that this guy was twice convicted. I think he was in prison for dealing in illegal substances and burglary. Mr. Nolan managed to get a commutation of the sentence on the second conviction. Apparently, he is an influential person in general. The feds were investigating, and this Kyle Richard contacted another suspect they were looking for in connection with crimes related to the illegal trafficking of prohibited drugs, Joey continued. My thoughts went back to Jessica, her friends, and family. I imagined their faces at the news. I started to smile. That's not all, Mikey, Joey said, and I was thrilled. They found illegal drugs and stolen items in his car and truck. They think he was going to run away again. He had suitcases in his truck full of all kinds of clothes and other things. I started laughing. Rachel joined me on the couch, shaking her head and laughing too. She had no idea what she was laughing at and what made me so happy. So, what's up with Jessica? I asked, and Rachel turned around and stared at me. I put my hand on the phone and whispered to her, "You won't believe it," I said, shaking my head and leaving her in limbo. Joey was still talking when I put the phone to my ear. She was arrested. Her parents somehow managed to hide it from the press. I expect that in the next few days, they will become front-page news. In the end, this is big news, he said. I think Joey was more excited than I was because honestly, all the feelings I had for Jessica, bad or not, disappeared. I reached for Rachel's hand and squeezed it to confirm this fact. After finishing the conversation, I eagerly turned to Rachel and told her everything. She was shocked and surprised because even though she knew that Jessica was a terrible person, it never occurred to her that she could be a criminal. All I could think about was what her parents, family, and the so-called social elite thought about her. Poor old daddy has a daughter who is a convicted criminal, and this can't help but be liked at the country club, I laughed to myself, and Rachel realized what I was thinking and laughed with me. A few days later, this story was on the front page of all newspapers in the district and on all information channels. Apparently, Jessica's parents still had some leverage over society because almost nothing was said about her. The fraudster who trades in illegal drugs got on our screens, but the name of his accomplice who moved in elite circles of society and was known in the corporate financial world was not called. Less than a week later, one of the newspapers published a photo of both of them with the numbers of prisoners but without mentioning Jessica's name. We managed to find out that Kyle Reed is actually 41 years old, not 35 as he claimed. So, my ex-wife actually left me for an elderly criminal who had just ruined her life. Maybe she wasn't as smart as she thought she was. I was shocked by the image of my ex-wife. I had to look closely to recognize her. She was like a shadow of that self-confident and arrogant woman who left me almost 8 months ago. She looked emaciated, aged, with thinning hair and huge dark bags under her eyes. I looked up and saw my beautiful pregnant bride who looked the complete opposite. I felt like the happiest person in the world, not only because I have her, but also because I got rid of my ex and her family. In the following months, the whole problem came to naught. We celebrated our first family Christmas in our new home. Rachel's parents came to see us, Helen and Joey dropped by, and I was surprised to see that several of my old friends from the days of working at the construction site got in touch again. They loved Rachel too, and it was they who persuaded me to return to construction. Rachel and Jasmine agreed with them, and that's another reason I love them. In the new year, I quit my job and became an individual entrepreneur. I worked at a construction site and also did minor work at my place of residence. Ironically, I began to receive many requests for gardening in several districts. I was even surprised that Peter and Shelley contacted me, but only on condition that I promised not to try anything with Shelley. They gave me their word. In March, Rachel gave birth to our opposite-sex twins, Alex and Sophia. In April, we got married in a small ceremony in Albany. A little more than a year has passed since the divorce from Jessica, and it's scary to even think how much has happened during this time. But unfortunately, this was not the last meeting with her. My new ideal life was going so well until a visitor unexpectedly knocked on my door. His name was Andrew Brown of the law firm Jones & Brown, who defended Miss Jessica Walker in the upcoming trial. I was surprised that she went back to her maiden name. Of course, Mom and Dad wouldn't like it if Walker's good name was smeared in the notorious dirt. Mr. Brown made himself comfortable in my house. While he was talking, "We would like you to give a good testimony about the character of Jess, that is, Miss Walker," he asked bluntly. I laughed. "Why would I do that?" I answered. "Well, before your divorce, you knew Miss Walker better than anyone else. You know she's honest and would never get involved in any crime, right?" I do not know if he asked or told me, but even I could see what he was driving at. "And if he refuses," a voice behind me suddenly asked. Rachel appeared from somewhere, apparently eavesdropping on our conversation. Mr. Brown looked at me. "So, how about what my wife said?" I suggested. "Well, we can get a subpoena and force you to attend. If you don't show up, we can charge you and put you in jail," he said in a now threatening tone. My first reaction was to punch him in the face and throw him headfirst through the door. But when I looked at my wife, I realized that I was losing too much. I had no idea if what he was saying was right or even legal, but at one court hearing, I agreed with his demands. It was easier that way, and here I am sitting in the courthouse waiting room. The trial has been going on for several days, and when my speech was approaching, I turned to Rachel. "What should I say, dear?" I asked in a whisper. She took my hand, looked at me with her beautiful brown eyes, and said, "You are the most honest and loving person I have ever known. Just be honest." I knew that what I would say in court would most likely have nothing to do with the case. I was forced to attend the trial by representatives of my ex-wife's legal service. They mistakenly assumed that I would speak very well of her. It was probably the biggest mistake of their lives because I wasn't going to do anything like that. Kyle Reed's trial ended a few days ago. He was found guilty of Class C bigamy, possession of prohibited drugs, and fraud. He was charged with numerous charges of fraud against the U.S. government, and this was the third crime. As a result, he received a long prison term, 70 years. I must admit that even I was stunned by the severity of the punishment. In an attempt to get a more lenient sentence, he accused Jessica of fraud and trafficking in stolen goods. According to him, she was involved in this case from the very beginning as they created a holding company shortly after the wedding. It seems that in this situation, the statement that a thief has no honor is true. The charges of theft of property were disputed, but when it came to fraud, the tax service had all the evidence. "Mr. Green, we are ready to receive you," the bailiff announced. I stood up and took a deep breath. Rachel went to sit with the audience, and Jasmine stayed in the waiting room, looking after our sleeping twins. They were completely unaware of what was happening around us. As my name echoed through the courtroom, I headed for the witness stand, feeling the piercing stares of everyone present. The atmosphere was unusually unsettling. When I went to the podium, a wave of sighs swept through the hall, especially from those who were sitting behind the defendant. Solemnly swearing to tell the truth, I turned to face the audience and met Jessica's eyes for the first time in a year. She was standing in front of me, dressed in an orange prison uniform, surrounded by an immaculately assembled defense team. Although her gaze was directed downward, I managed to establish a connection with her parents and several of her friends sitting behind her. Among the crowd, I noticed several people who, watching what was happening, uttered the word "wow." When I stood on the witness stand, the irony of the situation did not leave me. Throughout our marriage, they always looked down on me, but now everything has changed. Andrew Brown, who was standing in front of me, got up and addressed me. "Thank you for coming today, Mr. Green," he said. Unable to resist, I replied, "Well, I didn't have much choice, did I, Mr. Brown?" My words hung in the air, making him flinch, and all eyes turned to him, waiting for his reaction. At that moment, Jessica finally raised her head and looked in my direction. She opened her eyes wide, and her jaw dropped in disbelief. Tears welled up in her eyes and flowed down her face, attracting the attention of others. It was obvious that reality had hit her with all its force. The man she had once loved so much was back, and the man she had unintentionally harmed was no more. Overcome with grief, she found herself inconsolable. When the judge turned to her lawyer, asking if he needed some time to clean up, ignoring the suggestion, he continued. "The defendant's ex-husband, Mr. Green, treated my client fairly during their divorce, as he himself admitted. Can't we agree that the charges against her came as a surprise, even to you?" I was stunned when he did not demand objections from the prosecutor. Shock was visible on my face, but when it came to the fair treatment of divorce, I answered confidently, realizing that our views on this issue differ. There was a murmur among the people standing behind him, and I noticed that Jessica's parents were talking to one of the team members, while Jessica continued to sob. "All right, Mr. Green," he continued, "but can you confirm that throughout the entire period of your relationship with the defendant, she has consistently shown honesty, a firm work ethic, and abided by the law? For 4 months, she cheated on me with a man she imagined as younger, attractive, and successful." This incident once again highlighted our different understanding of honesty, to which I replied. At that moment, I began to believe that her legal representatives realized a possible mistake on their part. It is important to note that he was just threatening me without presenting an impeccable image of an innocent woman. I was just following Rachel's advice, to be honest. But would you agree that during this period, you may have inadvertently overlooked your own physical and intellectual well-being? He said sharply. Can you blame the defendant for leaving when someone better showed up? There was a collective expression of disapproval from both the public and the prosecution bench, indicating that in their opinion, their presence at that moment was unnecessary. It seemed that the defense team was ruthlessly attacking the credibility of my ex-wife. The judge intervened, restoring order and giving me time to think about my answer. I admitted that I really neglected some aspects of my life. Living with a woman who controlled all the moments of my life was an incredibly difficult ordeal. Even worse was that her family and friends thought I was flawed. I remember one case when the defendant's father openly called me handsome but not a stupid person. The reaction of the defense team, expressing shock and bewilderment, was almost comical. At that moment, Jessica was looking at me with pity in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy for her. Although Mr. Green may have had his grievances, there is no evidence that the defendant has ever engaged in criminal activity. There is no evidence indicating dishonesty or fraudulent intentions during our life together. She constantly paid her bills, even temporarily covered yours, and never engaged in any illegal activity. Is that so? He asked, looking visibly agitated. The prosecutor quickly objected, getting to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning is unacceptable. The witness is not here to prove the innocence of the defendant. This is a senseless waste of the court's time, she said. The judge agreed and stated, the protest is accepted. The defense can rephrase the question. Mr. Brown looked puzzled, trying to find an alternative approach. He exhaled and continued the interrogation. Mr. Green, during the time that you were together, the defendant constantly showed honesty, paying all her bills, taxes, and mortgage. She even covered your expenses for a while, right? He asked. I nodded and answered, yes, it is, but I do not know what kind of person she has become over the past year. Mr. Brown objected and directed his gaze at the judge, perplexed. I asked, what do you mean by objection, Mr. Brown? You represent him as a witness of your character, the judge remarked, barely suppressing the laughter that rang out in the courtroom. The jurors looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Your Honor, the judge continued, his tone becoming increasingly agitated, this man is undoubtedly a vindictive ex-husband who harbors a grudge against the woman who left him and moved on. The defense representatives exchanged anxious glances, their concern palpable, and Jessica's tears streaming down her cheeks cast desperate glances at her parents, then at the lawyer. The judge again intervened in the process, asking the question, if he really is an embittered ex-husband, then why did you decide to call him as a witness? The prosecution representatives leaned back in their chair and exchanged knowing smiles. Mr. Brown broke the silence with a question that sounded skeptical. Is it true that you are just an embittered man who wants to cause suffering to his ex-wife? If this accusation had been made 11 months ago, perhaps there would have been some truth in it, but since then, I've stopped feeling angry, Your Honor. I may not have a great mind, but I am proud of my honesty. Please, Mr. Green, your ex-wife left you for another man. Do you still harbor any grudge or dislike towards her and her family? What is it? He asked. Absolutely not, as I said. Perhaps 11 months ago, one would have assumed that I was experiencing similar emotions, but since then, I have met the most exquisite woman in the world, I said, fixing my gaze on the public gallery, right at Rachel. All eyes followed my line of sight until they focused on her. She not only elevated me but also brought me together, and now she is my beloved wife. Moreover, she blessed me with 3 wonderful children. We are surrounded by wonderful friends, an extraordinary family, an amazing home, and a thriving business. Who can feel resentment in such a situation? I declared without taking my eyes off my amazing wife, and a smile was forever imprinted on my face. She smiled back, nodding in agreement. Shifting my gaze, I noticed the tension on the faces of the defenders, and Jessica's parents lowered their eyes. Jessica looked devastated, tears streaming down her face. When our eyes met, I quietly whispered my thanks to her, and she went limp in her arms, collapsing on the table. With that, I left and returned to my family. When I entered the room, my attention was attracted by a loud commotion, in the center of which was Jessica. She was shouting apologies and declarations of love, but I wasn't sure if they were addressed to me. And to tell the truth, I didn't care. Jessica was convicted of conspiracy to commit a crime aimed at defrauding the U.S. government. It seems that the court found that Kyle Reed is not smart enough to carry out his plans on his own. I came across links to various articles, but I didn't understand what they meant. In addition, she was found guilty of possession of stolen goods in the 5th degree, which is classified as a Class A misdemeanor. As a result, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison, which effectively deprived her of the opportunity to resume her career in the financial sector after being released. If we talk about brighter moments, my life is currently flourishing. Gemini is growing fast, their radiant smiles able to brighten up even the gloomiest moments, although they happen infrequently. Besides, my business is thriving now. Rachel has a small group of clients who come to our house for hair and makeup treatments. Meanwhile, Jasmine is effortlessly studying in her final year of college, which I am currently funding. It's the least I can do for her, considering she once saved my life. Story 2. Having been married for 3 years, I began to notice some recurring patterns in the behavior of my beloved wife. I believe that many spouses face this, but these behaviors were not conscious on her part, and as it turned out, they bothered me a lot. Of course, her actions were not intended to deliberately provoke me. She constantly claimed that my remarks, which later turned into accusations, were completely false and showed my own erroneous judgments. I interpreted this as the fact that she simply does not realize the consequences of her privileged upbringing as an only child. Throughout her childhood, she did not experience rivalry with siblings. She did not have to fight for space, property, or attention. As a result, she never had to adapt to the home environment. During the first 2 years of our marriage, I silently endured this behavior. Gradually becoming aware of its presence, it became noticeable that this behavior was becoming more annoying and causing me suffering. At first, when I plucked up the courage and told my wife about it, she denied their existence. But when I began to persistently raise this topic, she eventually stopped denying their existence but rejected their importance, suggesting that I should not worry about them. In fact, she expected me to adapt to her, not the other way around. To be honest, some of these behaviors didn't particularly upset me at first. I perceived it as her unique approach to life. But in the last couple of years, additional methods have appeared, and the combination of her old and new methods gradually destroyed our relationship. She didn't pay much attention to my emotions. Whenever I expressed my concern about her seemingly indifferent, dismissive, or humiliating actions, her reaction was invariably dismissive. Often it looked something like this: "I don't understand why you're so worried about nothing. Just forget about it. I've heard your complaints countless times, and I'm already sick of your complaints." When I tried to suggest mild changes in her behavior or attitude, her reaction became increasingly arrogant, belittling, and annoying towards me. I couldn't help but wonder how I didn't notice these traits during the period of our acquaintance or even in the early stages of our marriage. Has it really changed, or is it just that I have become more aware of its features? Why do these seemingly harmless actions now cause me a feeling of mental and emotional emptiness? Memories of my father's advice, which I repeated as a child, echoed in my head, reminding me that I would never be able to change the true nature of a person. I realized that the only person I can change is myself. It seemed that the person who gave me this message was hinting that I needed to adjust my life somehow. Similarly, my wife apparently shared the same opinion. She wasn't going to change, and I, as her husband, had to adjust to her. Let me give you a short list of her actions that irritated me. For example, when she sat down at the table to eat, her elbows moved apart, taking up almost 2 places. Instead of moving her elbows closer to her body, she simply pushed the adjacent chairs further away. She was used to the fact that all the space belonged to her and was annoyed when someone invaded her personal territory. I think this behavior is related to her childhood when she never had to share a place with someone. On the contrary, I had to constantly fight for elbow room with my older brothers and sisters, who did not want to give up their comfortable seats at the dinner table. As a child, my mother verbally corrected me when I made a mistake, and if I stubbornly disobeyed, she punished me with a quick spanking, which effectively corrected my behavior. This experience taught me important manners, such as eating by pulling up my elbows and tying them to my torso. Being a well-mannered young gentleman, I always opened the doors to women, allowing them to enter first. But when my wife came to the doorway to enter the house, she often stopped inside to take off her coat, hat, or adjust her shoes. Unfortunately, if I was behind her, I found myself in the rain, patiently waiting for her to pass on at her leisurely pace. I politely asked her to step forward, but she remained motionless. Trying to help, I gently pushed her a little more inside, which apparently upset her. In response, she began to get indignant, accusing me of rudeness, insensitivity, and importunity. When I pointed out that I was wet from the rain and she was in no hurry to take off her raincoat, she denied that I had suffered from it. Lately, I've been telling her that I refuse to tolerate her disrespectful behavior in exchange for enduring the rain. It seemed to me that I was in a losing situation, either get wet or endure her verbal insults. As a result, she distanced herself from me for the rest of the day. She claims that she doesn't like my attitude towards her, but I claim that I don't like getting wet in the rain and putting up with her offensive statements. When we go out to eat, which happens often because she doesn't like to do the dishes, she always chooses the seat in the booth closest to us, leaving me standing in an awkward position while she sits down herself. When we were shown to a table, I gave up trying to help her sit down as a gentleman should. Instead, she chose the chair closest to her, not bothering to look around and see if there was anyone behind her, whether it was another customer or a waiter. Pulling hard, she would sit down in her seat, leaving me standing still and looking like an uncultured fool. Another of her habits is to choose the end of the pew for herself, inconveniencing everyone else who has to step over it to find their place. Anyone who tried to climb over it was met only with a half-smile bordering on sullenness and a noticeable lack of attempts to facilitate the entrance by spreading their knees. It seems that she, like her parents, was raised in the belief that others exist only to satisfy her needs. The concept of sharing, be it toys or clothes, was never instilled in her in the process of upbringing. As a result, she keeps all her old things and does not give them away. Even the most spacious dressing room that we could afford in a modest house that we painstakingly built over 2 years will never be able to accommodate her huge collection. She constantly complains that she needs 2 separate closets, winter and summer. It is curious that when I propose to make 4 cabinets, one for each season, she is perplexed and sarcastically remarks that this is the only decent idea that has come to my mind all year. Gradually, I realize that she unconsciously perceives me as the person responsible for satisfying all her whims. My own needs and desires have practically no meaning in her eyes. My life was gradually turning into such a picture. Is it possible that her desires were always treated as needs, and my needs were rejected as just desires? I'm starting to realize how humiliating this dynamic is and how it affects me. Our paths crossed during our student years. She openly admitted that the only purpose of her college studies was to find a husband who would provide for her indefinitely. At that time, I was inexperienced and in love, fascinated by her restrained beauty. Her shyness, which intrigued me, seemed to disappear the moment we said our vows. Despite her perfect physique, she never dressed to emphasize her attractive curves. With the exception of a few closed-mouth kisses, her body remained inaccessible to me until we tied the knot. Studying psychology and medicine in college, I began to pay closer attention to how she structured her sentences. I listened carefully to her intonations and the tone she used in conversation with me. Although she has always been extremely polite to others, for the past 2 years, I have not been able to shake the feeling that I am being treated badly, especially behind closed doors. I was pleased that she never belittled me in public. It was the only thing I appreciated. But in private conversations, she never used polite phrases like please or could you. Instead, she just said, "John, you must do this and that." Although I didn't mind doing most of her requests, I was increasingly annoyed by being ordered rather than asked, whether it was helping with housework or checking the air pressure in the tires of our car. I would still be willing to do it, but the fact that I was told what to do and not offered continued to annoy me. If I did not immediately complete the task, abandoning all my affairs for the sake of fulfilling her wishes, she persistently reminded me not to forget and continued to do so until I reached my limit and gave up just to silence her for a while. Her behavior was passive and far from ideal. She insisted that a good wife should allow her husband to engage in intimate life, but she did not consider it necessary to take an active part in this. I remain skeptical about whether she has ever experienced real pleasure from intimacy. Whenever I sincerely tried to bring her to desire with romantic foreplay, she rejected it and urged me to speed up the process. I am not satisfied that she refrains from experiencing true pleasure from making love, while I strive to satisfy her. I constantly told her that her pleasure would bring me great joy, but I realized that my attempts to please myself by pleasing her did not coincide with her desires. It seems that her own pleasure is not a priority for her, even if it brings her pleasure. She is influenced by the belief that her intimate life is unclean and that making love is an unpleasant act that men want, and married women should tolerate it. I've never encountered this with any of the women I've been with. It's a pity that the woman I married turned out to be so difficult. Despite being married for 3 years, the relationship was mostly one-sided, and we had no children. She had to work from the very beginning, and I even dropped out of college to find a job and support us so that she wouldn't have to work after her sophomore year. With her, I felt like I wasn't going anywhere in life, and it was happening fast. I had reached a breaking point and decided that it was time for a serious conversation with myself. I realized that I couldn't live like this anymore. Despite having free time, my partner did not take the initiative either in cooking dinner or in spending intimate moments together. It became clear that she did not intend to change, and I refused to conform to the life she represented. It was extremely important for my own well-being to take action. I was eager to graduate from college and go to medical school, while she seemed to be solely focused on the quick financial gain promised by television advertising. I had a conversation with my parents, who showed some understanding but did not provide real support. Realizing that I would have to deal with this situation alone, I took matters into my own hands. Firstly, I opened a separate bank account in my own name only, while keeping our old joint account for the sake of persuasiveness. I purchased a separate credit card for her, stating that when changing the card, she would be better served. As a result, our joint credit accounts were closed, and I received my own credit card. To completely sever financial ties with her, I transferred the documents to the house in her name. I consulted with a lawyer to start the divorce process and requested the necessary documents to ensure that my spouse would receive everything except alimony. I agreed that the documents would be delivered to her place of residence in exactly a week. I paid for the lawyer's services in full, which amounted to a reasonable $300, provided that my spouse would not dispute the divorce. In order to maintain financial independence, I decided to receive my last salary personally and not by direct deposit. Fortunately, our joint account had a 3-month supply of funds for living. Despite the problems created by my wife, I managed to work diligently and save money. Finally, the long-awaited day of handing over the divorce papers came, marking the beginning of my newfound freedom. It was the day following my last day of work, which I had submitted my resignation a few weeks earlier. Although having breakfast together was not uncommon, this morning it had a different meaning. I informed her that I decided not to go to work that day. When we were sitting at the table opposite each other, sipping coffee and finishing toast, I looked into her eyes and said, "Darling, today I'm giving you what you've been dreaming about the most. I allow you to provide for yourself without any resentment and guilt for my desires, which may interfere with your happiness. Now you are free from the need to enter into intimate relations with me or to endure my complaints that I'm under the cold rain while you take off your raincoat. There is no longer a need to constantly ask me to lubricate the door or check the tires. The dishes will fit in the dishwasher exactly the way you prefer. From now on, the thermostat can be adjusted to the desired temperature without objection. You will never have to complain about the fact that clothes were left overnight in the washing machine and not transferred to the dryer, as I guarantee that this will not happen again. Moreover, I will refrain from turning on the dryer at night. You'll never have to remind me to fill up the car. You no longer have to constantly remind me to mow the lawn to your liking. My snoring won't bother you anymore, and you won't have to ask me to pick up your dirty laundry from the floor and put it in the washing machine. Today, I will hand you the prepaid divorce papers that you will receive this morning. By signing them, you will not bear any financial burden to get rid of me and all the unpleasant things that are connected with our relationship. In addition, I'm giving you sole ownership of the car and the house. All the bills are paid, and you have enough money in the bank to feed yourself for the next 3 months until you find a job. I'm leaving for the airport in 30 minutes, and my personal belongings are already packed and shipped. If you were paying attention, you would have noticed that my things were missing from the guest room where I lived for the last year. Over the past month, they have been packed and shipped to my new city and apartment. Now all that remains is to give you my discolored engagement ring, a constant reminder of the fake gold it was made of when you bought it for me. I will miss coffee, but most of all, I will be glad that you finally got rid of my nagging about my personal and intimate self-realization. With that, I took off my wedding ring and handed it to her. She looked at me without saying a word, and I tried to wash off as many green spots as possible when I was leaving the house with only my overnight bag. She called out to me, "John, why did you take so long? Jerry's been trying to get me to get rid of you for almost 2 years. We won't have to hide from you anymore. Looks like you finally got all my hints. Thank you for covering the costs of a no-fault divorce. I will be happy to sign it." On the threshold, I stopped to collect my thoughts. She cheated on me for so long, and I didn't even suspect and didn't consider such a possibility. Live and learn, forever. I think I made one more stop before heading to the subway. I went to the bank and withdrew all the money we had been saving for 3 months. Then I visited our safe deposit box and took out the documents for the car, which was issued only in my name and had no debts. Only the ownership of the house remains in the cell. The marriage certificate was in the office of my lawyer, who was going to dispose of it after the divorce was finalized. There was nothing to do but go home and pick up another thing left behind. It seemed that we had won and lost almost everything we had. I knew that Jerry, whoever he was, would learn what it was like to have an only child as a wife. I hope it will take him not 2 but 20 years to figure it out. I knocked on the door of my former home, and Sherry answered. "What are you doing here?" "I thought you were already at the airport," she said. She didn't seem to regret what had happened at all. "Honey, since this Jerry is going to support you now, I decided that you don't need a car or money in the bank, so I'm taking both. Give him my best wishes." I smiled and waved as I drove out onto the road to my future. Later, I got a good job in another city, then graduated from college on an ROTC scholarship. I not only remained a gentleman but also became an officer. Fortunately, I didn't hear anything more about Sherry. It's been 11 years since I met Sherry last week when I was in town for my dad's funeral. Before you get upset, I want to clarify that I visited my parents as often as possible, usually between business trips, as already mentioned. I became a Marine Corps officer and, to a lesser extent, a gentleman. I am currently serving in MARSOC with the rank of major and spend most of my time in reconnaissance forces. So, I was in full dress uniform when my father's old army buddies asked me to look at it, and who am I to refuse Vietnam veterans? They said I looked impressive with my medals, among which were 3 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a Silver Star received for 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 to Iraq. So, going back to the story, I ran into Sherry at my father's funeral, and she had changed a lot. She had gained about 30 kilograms and did not look very elegant. We decided to meet the next day to finally talk. I found out that she works as a waitress at a diner. She and Jerry have 2 children, but he was nowhere to be found. It turned out that he was caught in bed with another married woman, and her husband did not take it lightly. As a result, poor Jerry spent a month in the hospital and disappeared after discharge. Sherry is having a hard time, but she looks happy. She finally apologized for her past behavior. I got the impression that she would like to start all over again but did not say so directly. I talked about my career, about my wife whom I met while recovering from injuries at the regional medical center, and about our 4 children. We talked for 4 hours, but it was time for me to get back to North Carolina. I promised to stay in touch. When I returned to my wife and children, she asked me how it went. I hugged her to me and cried, not about what could have been, but about what is. I am really happy in my life, and everything in the world is fine. Have the courage to admit your mistakes, leave, and move on, and not throw hints. It's disappointing. I'm glad that everything went well in her life, and she got what she deserved. Story 3. I don't remember the exact moment when I had my suspicions. It was in the early years of my marriage to Freya, my beloved wife. Our paths crossed shortly after graduation from university. We ended up together at her friend's birthday party, where, by coincidence, her friend's partner turned out to be a close acquaintance of mine. It became obvious that I was invited with the intention of making a couple with Freya, since immediately after my arrival, she was introduced to me. Before I knew it, we were deep in conversation, completely oblivious to the unfamiliar faces around us. I was captivated by the radiance of her smile and the sparkle in her eyes every time she appeared. The sincere warmth and friendliness emanating from her were incredibly mesmerizing, and I was endlessly fascinated by this sight. In the process of our acquaintance, I began to notice that her eyes lit up only for me. We exchanged numbers and decided to have coffee the next day, which turned into a whole day spent together. A year later, we moved in together, and 2 years later, we tied the knot. I believe that her behavior began to change when she started working at a new job about 2 years after our marriage. She was unhappy with her job and felt that her career had stalled. Naturally, I supported her aspiration. I noticed that her luster had dimmed, and I noticed that the work began to influence her. "How was your first day?" I asked her when she started working. As soon as she got home, there was a sparkle in her eyes again as she smiled, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she took me upstairs, and we made love. Having settled into her new job, Freya began to pay great attention to her career. She quickly got several promotions and soon earned more than me. When I mentioned that my boss was leaving, Freya asked if I was considering such an opportunity. "Come on, Charlie, you may well lead your team," she encouraged. Her lack of enthusiasm irritated me. The problem was that if Freya was driven by her career, then I was more of a working-to-live person. I was not attracted to any leadership role, and I absolutely did not like office politics. Don't get me wrong, I was getting a good income, enough to maintain my lifestyle and have some additional opportunities. I was happy with my role as a system administrator, especially because it allowed me to earn enough to travel every year. We went on numerous trips exploring different countries. I loved going on adventures, especially with Freya. I believe that she loved them just as much and enjoyed experiencing them with me. But when Freya started taking work calls and participating in conference calls during our vacation, the situation became awkward. She even took a work laptop with her on trips and insisted on staying in hotels with Wi-Fi. "I need to take this call," she said. "This is a very important meeting. Could you please continue?" I need to finish. Our conversations soon turned into arguments about how work was more important to her than our time together. I was glad that she was enjoying her work, but it prevented us from spending time together. Moreover, when she looked at me, the sparkle in her eyes disappeared. At the moment, I didn't suspect that she was having an affair, at least not with another person, but it seems that work had become the main focus for her. After a recent promotion, she often had to work late, participate in conference calls with the American office, and go on business trips. I understand what you're thinking, but her job requires such responsibilities. My biggest concern was whether she would be offered a job in New York. I understood that if she was offered this job, our marriage would most likely break up. Although we were growing apart, I still loved her, even despite her long working days, frequent business trips, and lack of time for me. Previously, I could not determine exactly when my suspicions arose, but now I am sure of it. When my company was acquired and I realized that I was facing downsizing, I wasn't too worried. Despite the financial uncertainty, Freya's earnings were enough for both of us to live. I was to receive a substantial redundancy allowance, which would allow me to continue working at home while looking for a new job. However, after losing my job, I had to suspend my travels for a while. Around the same time, Freya began discussing a colleague who had been temporarily transferred to her office from the New York office. She couldn't contain her admiration, enthusiastically talking about how interesting he was, how popular he was with the ladies, and all the typical cliches. "He's so ambitious," she told me, stabbing a metaphorical dagger into my heart. Yes, you can see where everything is going, but this story is about how Freya's life collapsed because of my betrayal and not about the betrayal itself. When I returned from trips, she insisted that I call before going home. When I got home, the bed linen was consistently in the washing machine. I understand that the alarm signals were accumulating, but although I began to worry, I still did not have sufficient grounds for suspicion of infidelity. But our fading intimacy no longer existed. Freya offered only brief kisses. If she used to constantly talk about her American colleague, now she had stopped. She jealously guarded her phone and asked about my next trip. At that moment, I was sure that she was cheating on me. Remember two things: never deceive those who work in the field of technology, and scammers become complacent when they think they can get away with anything. I have a passion for both travel and technology. I have never aspired to a promotion because it would distract me from technical work, and I collect equipment. I often bought old equipment from my company: webcams, modems, memory cards. I had boxes full of them. Therefore, it was not difficult for me to develop a small spyware. I set up wireless webcams all over the house, in the living room, at the front door, in the bedroom. All of them were connected to an old laptop, which I converted into a web server. I downloaded several free programs from the internet and created my own spy recording system, which I later used to organize my own business. I called it that, but it was actually a homemade video surveillance system. Although incredibly impressive, being away from home allowed me to install everything, and Freya working late gave me the opportunity to install everything. I was genuinely proud of what I had done. There was even sound in the system. After everything was ready, I finally caught her doing it. To be honest, I assumed that the batteries and the webcams would run out before I got any proof, but Freya was apparently desperate for intimacy because they wasted no time as soon as he appeared. Now that I had the evidence, it turned out to be quite difficult to find and view it. Freya started coming home earlier and looking sullen. She became a little more attentive but still refused to be intimate with me. Later, she informed me that she had to leave for America. She was visibly excited about the trip. I assumed that she was going to spend this week both at work and having an affair with this man. I planned to give her a serious confrontation on her return, and when she left, I downloaded a film editing program and edited what could be called a pornographic video with her lover. While I was watching the video, anger was boiling in me. "Don't stop, Kyle." "Kyle," she exclaimed. So, that was his name. Strangely, when I learned his name, I felt some satisfaction, although I could not explain why. I paused the recording and felt my heart ache. At that moment, it broke off. I watched Freya raise her head and saw her shining eyes and sincere smile, the one she usually reserved for me. When I looked at Freya, shining in Kyle's eyes, tears were streaming down my face. At that moment, I received a message from Freya: "I love you. I miss you," accompanied by affectionate and intimate pictures. To be honest, it took me by surprise. Exhausted after the editorial work, I decided to call it a day. But my vacation plans were interrupted by Freya's unexpected call at midnight. She confessed her love to me with genuine sincerity and how much she missed me. From such an influx of emotions, I felt depressed all week. I diligently did my editing work, preferring to sleep not in my room but in a free one since I could not accept the idea that I would rest there. I was looking forward to Freya's return, wanting to show her the footage, and at the same time carefully kept her constant reminders of her love for me during telephone conversations. As I watched Freya and Kyle's passionate embrace, it dawned on me, Freya was constantly talking about her plans to leave me and move to America, and Kyle remained indifferent. Strangely, Freya didn't seem to notice his absence. The sudden revelation hit me like a lightning bolt: Kyle was married. I couldn't help but exclaim out loud, startled by the realization of this fact. This explained why Freya expressed her love and longing for me. She went to America only to find out about Kyle's marital status. But on her return on Saturday, Freya returned to her normal life. We made love every day, and even the change of time zones did not interfere with our passion. I sincerely apologize for my emotional detachment over the past year. I really love you and really want to create a family with you, she said with unshakable conviction. But doubts began to creep into my thoughts when she was unexpectedly sent home from work due to illness. For a whole week, she did not leave the house, explaining her fatigue with a long business trip. When you truly love a person, you tend to believe their explanations, even if they are deceptive. But everything changed one fine morning when I saw that she was ill and noticed the guilty expression on her face that she was trying to hide. When I approached her, a chill ran through my veins. I offered to stay at home in the evening and watch a movie, stressing that she needed rest. Smiling tenderly, she nodded weakly in agreement. In the late afternoon, I made wine and popcorn, and when I settled down next to her, she snuggled up to me. She asked curiously what we were going to watch. Preserving the element of surprise, I replied, "It's a secret." But when I pressed the play button, footage of Freya's intimate relationship with Kyle appeared on the TV screen. Feeling her discomfort, Freya tensed up and urged me to turn off the TV. When she uttered the words "baby" addressed to Kyle from the TV, her voice was barely audible. "Turn it off," she demanded, her voice getting louder and filled with panic. Ignoring her request, I witnessed how she completely lost her temper. In a fit of anger, she got up from her seat and threw a glass of wine at the TV, causing a chaotic explosion of glass fragments and crimson liquid. She turned to face me, her expression wild, and her eyes wide with fright. "Turn it off! Turn it off," she repeated. Seeing Freya losing control of herself, I finally gave in to her demands. Now it was necessary to talk. "Why, Freya? Why did you do that? Your lack of ambition in life is just infuriating," she told me. "At least you mean Kyle," I interrupted. When I mentioned his name, a wave of guilt washed over her, making her infidelity undeniable. "I'm sorry, Charlie. I made a mistake, but I'm ready to devote my whole life to you," Freya said, and tears flowed down her face. Her deceit and lies were catching up with her. "Now it's just awful," I shouted at her. "I love you, Charlie," she begged desperately. "I love you. You were ready to leave me for Kyle. You only came back when you found out he was married," I said. "How did you find out?" asked Freya in surprise. "It was clearly visible. When you were talking, he never dared to do anything, and you were too blind to see it," I replied. "Charlie, please, I love you," Freya insisted. "You're pregnant, aren't you?" I told her straight out. She stared at me in horror, and then a crushing reality hit me. "My God, you knew about your pregnancy before you left for America, and when you found out that he was married, you decided to have an intimate relationship with me so that I would believe that Kyle's child was mine," I accused her. Sobbing loudly, Freya fell to her knees, clutching my hand tightly. "The child is yours. He should be yours," she begged. Hearing this, I angrily pulled my hand away. "It's over between us, Freya. I want a divorce. I'll do a paternity test when the baby is born, but I doubt it's necessary. We both know he's not mine," I stated firmly. "I'm so sorry, Freya," she sobbed plaintively. "What have you done, Freya? You got pregnant with a child from a married man, and now you're going to become a single mother," I said, frustrated. Freya remained lying on the floor, sobbing, unable to look at me. Was it really that bad with me? Was I boring? I had ambitions, just not the way you wanted, I asked. "I'm sorry, Charlie," she said between sobs. "I got carried away with my career." How ambitious Kyle was. "I couldn't understand why you don't pursue a career the way I do." When I found out that Kyle was married and a terrible person, and that I was pregnant with his child, I realized too late what I had done. When I talked to him about leaving you, it was after I found out I was pregnant. I planned to surprise him when we went to New York, but his wife and children met him at the airport. At that moment, I felt that my whole life was collapsing around me. You were my only hope. I wanted the child to have a father, and I knew that you would be the perfect father. I had to carry your baby. We were supposed to create a family together, a happy family, and now I've ruined everything, Freya admitted. I was overcome with sympathy. She was honest, but I sympathized even more with the child who would become a constant reminder for Freya of her infidelity and that his biological father, who lives half a world away, wants nothing to do with him. It was a truly confusing situation. "You can stay here overnight, but I'll call your parents now, and they'll pick you up tomorrow." "I don't think you should go anywhere," I said. 6 months later, pregnant Freya agreed to all my demands in the divorce. She was crying all the time. I took less than I could have because she needed to provide for the child. The child was the real innocent side. I didn't feel any pleasure at being free of her. The court insisted on a paternity test, but when the child was born, the result was never announced. After the paternity test was confirmed and alimony was not required, our divorce was finalized. Freya's parents were ashamed and embarrassed for their daughter. They wished me all the best and advised me to move on. Freya told Kyle about the baby, but he, as befits a person, refused to admit that it was his child. I do not know if Freya will go to court in America and try to force him to admit his responsibility, but to be honest, this is not my problem. I sincerely wish Freya and the child all the best and hope that they will find a happy life. Her infidelity ruined her marriage, she lost friends, and ruined her career. She is a single mother with a child that the father does not want to recognize. Such a mistake will haunt her for the rest of her life. I hope that she will meet another person who will adopt this child and become his father. This kid deserves it. For me, everything is back to normal. I was made redundant. When I told them about myself and Freya, they were very confused. They probably thought they were kicking me when I was discouraged. I used the money I received from downsizing and the money from the sale of the house to start a business selling a video surveillance system that I created to catch Freya. The business grew quickly, and I sold it along with the patent, earning a fortune. I gave some of the money to Freya, who gratefully accepted it, but at the same time, she regretted telling me that I had no ambitions. She was going through difficult financial times, and relieving the stress associated with money helped her a lot. I know I shouldn't have done it, but I loved her anyway, even if I couldn't forgive her. She kept emailing me to apologize for everything. I met her for the last time at her parents' house to tell her that she should move on for her own happiness. I could never bring myself to hate her, but if I had, it would have happened on that day. It hurt me to see her like this. The girl was very cute and looked like Freya. She should have been yours, she told me, and asked if we still had a chance and begged me to become the father of the child. It was a desperate request full of regret and low self-esteem. Maybe the girl looked like Freya, but some parts of her looked like someone else who wasn't me, I replied. I'm sorry, Freya. I'm moving on. I hugged her until she started crying, until her mother came into the room to let me leave. Then, I went on a world tour to clear my head, where I met my second wife. She got pregnant by me before we got married, and that's the end of my traveling life until I retire. But that's fine with me.